In this video, we're going to take a look at the top 25 advanced pivot table tips and tricks for Excel. The first tip we're going to take a look at is using a table as the source data in your pivot tables. And this is going to make it a lot easier to update your pivot tables when you add new data. So if I go to the Insert tab and create a pivot table with this data, you can see that Excel references that data with a hard-coded range value. So I've got data in A1 to H1471. And if I create this pivot table and then later add data past row 1471, I'm going to need to update that range reference for the data to flow through to my pivot table. So instead, what we're going to do is go up to the Insert tab and first use the table command with our data. And our data has column headers in the first row. So we're going to leave this option checked here and press OK. And Excel creates a table object and our data is contained inside that table. And the first thing we're going to do is go up to the Table Design tab and give this a new name. So let's call it HR Data and press Enter. And now if we go to the Insert tab and create a pivot table, then you can see that Excel is referencing that table name instead now. And as long as you add data into the table, then that's going to flow through to your pivot tables. So let's create our pivot table, and let's just create a simple pivot table here with gender and monthly salary. And let's go back to our data and add some new data. So let's scroll down to the bottom and let's just copy the last row and paste it there. And you can see that this is inside our table still. And let's just update the value here to something really large so we can see it in our data. And let's go back to our pivot table and right click and refresh. And there we go, we get our new data in our pivot table. So the best practice is to always use a table as your source data for pivot tables. And it makes it a lot easier to add data into your pivot tables. If you want to see the detailed data behind any value inside a pivot table, you can do that with the Show Details option. So here we've got total monthly salaries of 41,724. If I right click on that and go to Show Details, then Excel's going to create a new sheet for me with only the data pertaining to that value. And you can see if I add up the monthly salary column here, we got 41,724. Now let's go back to our pivot table. You can do the same thing by double clicking on any cell. So let's double click on that cell. And here's a new sheet with the data behind that value. So that's the Show Details option, which allows you to see the detailed data behind any value in a pivot table. In this tip, we're going to take a look at deleting the source data in your workbook. So once you have a pivot table set up, you can actually delete the source data and you'll still be able to use the pivot table like normal. So here's my source data in this HR Data tab, and I can right click and delete that sheet and delete. And I'll still be able to use my pivot table as normal. So here I can move around fields or add in new fields if I want to, etc. So this is going to help with reducing the file size of your workbook, as well as preventing accidental editing of your source data. Now, if you want your source data back, you can always use the Show Details trick to get your data back. So you can show details on the grand total, right click and show details, and here's our source data back again. By default, pivot tables are going to display blank cells whenever there's no data for that combination of items. So for example, in our data, we don't have any females in the human resources job role with a doctor's level education. If you want to display some value here instead of a blank cell, you can do that. If you right click in the pivot table and open up the pivot table options and go to the Layout and Format tab, there's an option here for empty cells, and just make sure that's checked. And you can put a value here, so maybe 0, and press OK. And then instead of blank cells, we get a 0 displayed here. Now you don't have to display a number. You could display some text. So let's open up the pivot table options again And maybe instead of 0, we want to display no value. So that's how you can display a custom value instead of a blank cell in your pivot tables. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can show items in our pivot table that don't have any data. So in this pivot table, I've got job role and education level and gender in the rows area. And then if I look for healthcare representatives with a doctor level education, then I don't actually have any data for any females. And as a result, I only see males here. Now, if I want to show females and just have a blank cell for that value, then I can do that by selecting a cell in that field and right-clicking and opening up the field settings. So here's our field settings for the gender field. And if we go to the Layout and Print tab, there's an option here to show items with no data. We can check that off and press OK. And then in our pivot table, we get that value displayed here, and we get a blank cell because there's no data for that value. So that's how we can show items with no data in our pivot tables. In this tip, we're going to take a look at grouping together items in a field. So here we've got our education level field, and then we're showing the total monthly salary for those education levels. And let's say we want to further analyze this by those who went to university and those who didn't. Then we could use the grouping feature to do that. So we can select the items in our field that we want to group together. So let's select our doctors, bachelors, and if we hold control, we can select masters as well. And if we right click, we can group those together. And that's going to create a group with those 3 items in it. So here it's called group 1. We can rename that. And we can group the other 2 items together as well. Right click and group those. And rename that as well. And notice when you group items in a field, we get this new field here in our pivot table fields list. So it's called education level 2. And we can click on that and open the field settings and rename it to something more descriptive. And press enter. And once we have that new field, we don't need to have the field that it's based on in our pivot table. So we can remove our education level and we still have that field there in our pivot table. So that's how you can group together items in a field. In this tip, we're going to take a look at grouping numeric fields. So if we add a field like total working years into the rows area, then what happens is we get a list of all the unique values in that field. But what we actually might want is to have this grouped. So we can group numeric fields by right-clicking on the field and going to group. And that's going to bring up this numeric grouping menu. And we can enter a starting value and an ending value and a value to increment the groups by. So let's create groups of 5 years and press OK. And what we get is our experience levels in grouped buckets. So that's how we can group numeric fields in a pivot table. In this tip, we're going to take a look at grouping date fields. So when you add a date field into a pivot table, Excel is going to automatically group that field for you. So if I add the start date into the rows area, you can see that Excel has grouped those by years. And it's also added a quarters field. So we have a years and quarters field here. And we also have our original start date here. Now, if you don't want this automatic grouping, you can press Ctrl Z and that's going to ungroup those fields. Or if you want to change the grouping, you can right click on the date field and go to group. And that's going to open up this grouping menu for dates. So you can enter a starting and ending date, and then Excel is going to group anything before or after those dates into one single bucket. And we also have options down here on how to group our dates together. So we have years, quarters, days, hours, minutes, and seconds as well. So let's just say we wanted to show months. We can select our months field and press OK. And now our data is grouped into months. So that's how you can group a date field. Excel will automatically do the grouping, and you can edit that grouping by right-clicking and going to the group option. If you always want to be sure that you're working with the latest data in your pivot table, you can have Excel automatically refresh your pivot table when you open the file. To enable this setting, you can right-click on your pivot table and go to Pivot Table Options. And go to the Data tab, and there's an option here to refresh the data when opening the file. So we can check that off and press OK. And the next time you open this file, Excel is going to refresh your pivot tables to get the latest data. In this tip, we're going to take a look at using the Show Report Filter Pages option. So this is going to allow you to quickly create a pivot table for each item in a field. And to use this option, we need to have at least one field in our filters area. So here we've got education level, and we can see that filter up here in our pivot table. And education level has 5 items in it. And we can use this option to create a pivot table that's filtered on each of those items. So to do that, we can select our pivot table and go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab. And there's options here. We can click on that. And in there, there's the Show Report Filter Pages option. We can select that. And that's going to open up this menu where we can select which field in our filters area. So if we have multiple fields in there, we can select which one we want. In our case, we've only got this one. So let's select that and press OK. And in this case, Excel has created 5 new sheets. And each sheet contains our pivot table, and that pivot table is filtered on a single item. So this is the master's sheet, and it's been filtered on the master's item in education level. So that's how we can quickly create a pivot table for each item in a field. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can apply a label filter and a value filter at the same time. So if we go up to the sort and filter toggles, we have these options for label filters and value filters, but you can actually only apply one at a time. So if we try to add a label filter, and let's maybe try contains, and let's look at things that contain the word sales. And if we look at that, we can see this check mark indicating that we've got a label filter. And now if we try and add a value filter, so let's look at things less than $1 million. And press OK. Then you can see that that label filter checkmark has been removed, and we now have our checkmark next to our value filter. So we're only filtering on things less than $1 million now. If we want to apply both those filters at the same time, we need to enable that option. So we can right click on the pivot table and go to Pivot Table Options. And if we go to the Totals and Filters tab, there's an option here to allow multiple filters per field. We can check that and press OK. And now if we go back to our label filter and contains, and let's try contains sales again and press enter. Now we've got both those filters applied. So you can see that they're both checked there. And we're only showing things that contain the word sales and are under $1 million total salary. So that's how you can add multiple filters per field. We need to enable the option first. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can sort our pivot tables based on a value field. So here we've got job role and then the corresponding total monthly salary for that job role. And we can sort this pivot table based on our total monthly salary field. So let's click on the sort and filter toggle, and we can go to more sort options. And that's going to open up this sort menu for our job role field. And here we can choose either ascending or descending order. And then instead of job role, we can pick our monthly salary and press OK. And there we go. That's going to sort our pivot table based on the monthly salary column. And here we've sorted that in descending order. In this tip, we're going to take a look at creating a custom sort order in your pivot tables. So when you add a field into a pivot table, Excel is going to sort that field in alphabetical order by default. But if you want to display your results in another order other than alphabetical, you can do that with a custom list. So here I've got a field, education level, and it's currently in alphabetical order by default. But maybe we want to have it displayed in a different order. So maybe we want to have bachelor, master, and doctor appear first, and then below college and college level. We can do that with a custom list. So first we need to create a custom list. We can go to the File tab and go to Options and go to Advanced Options. And if we scroll down to the bottom, there's a General section. And here we have the option to edit custom lists. And we can actually import our custom list from Excel. So we can select that and select that range and click on Import. And we see our custom list here now. So we can press OK and press OK again. And now we've got our custom list set up. If we sort in alphabetical order, we lose that sort order. So what we're going to need to do is enable an option to use our custom list order instead of our alphabetical order. So we can right click on our pivot table and go to pivot table options. And in the totals and filters tab, there's an option to use custom lists when sorting. So we can enable that and press OK. And we get our sort order based on that custom list now. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can change the layout of a pivot table. So by default, we get a compact form layout, and that just means that when we have multiple fields in our rows area, we get them displayed in a single column in our pivot table. We can change this layout. So if we select our pivot table and go up to the Design tab, and in Report Layouts, we have a couple options here. So we're currently in compact form. Let's check out outline form. So in outline form, we get our fields in separate columns, but fields are still nested underneath each other. Let's check out the other option. So report layouts and tabular form. This time we get our fields in separate columns again, but there's no nested values here. So those are the different options available for the layout of your pivot table reports. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can repeat item labels in a pivot table. So when you're in outline form or tabular form, labels in your pivot table don't repeat by default. So for example, this pivot table here is in tabular form. And in my education level field, the first item here, bachelor, underneath it I have blank cells, so that label isn't repeating. We can change that so that the labels repeat. We can select our pivot table and go to the Design tab, and in Report Layouts, we can repeat all item labels, and that's going to fill the label down those blank cells for us. So that's how we can repeat item labels in a pivot table. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can turn off the automatic get pivot data formulas when you're trying to reference a value inside a pivot table. So when trying to reference a value inside a pivot table, Excel will automatically create a get pivot data formula for you, but you can easily turn this feature off. So let's press Escape. And if we select our pivot table and go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, under the options, we can turn off Generate Get Pivot Data. And now when we try and reference a value inside our pivot table, we get the standard cell references. So that's how you can turn off the automatic get pivot data formulas. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can prevent Excel from changing the column widths when you update or refresh a pivot table. So by default, when you refresh a pivot table, Excel is going to auto-fit the column widths for you. So if I right click and refresh my pivot table, you can see that the column widths change. If I don't want that to happen, I can change the options. So if I right click on my pivot table and go to Pivot Table Options, then in the Layout and Format tab, there's an option here to auto fit column widths on update. If we uncheck that and press OK, then column widths shouldn't change when we refresh our pivot tables. So if we change our column widths and then refresh our pivot table, those column widths won't change. In this tip, we'll take a look at how we can add new calculations into our pivot tables with calculated fields. So let's say that instead of monthly salary, we wanted to see annual salary. We could create a new calculation that multiplies that by 12. So let's select our pivot table and go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab. And in Fields, Items, and Sets, we can add a calculated field. And we can give our calculation a name. So let's call it annual salary. And our formula is going to be 12 times, and we're going to multiply the monthly salary by 12. So I can double click on that and add it into my formula. And then I can add this calculated field into my pivot table and press OK. And there we go. We've got a new field in our pivot table called annual salary, and it's 12 times the monthly salary. So that's how we can add calculated fields into our pivot tables. You can easily visualize your pivot tables with pivot charts. And when you create a pivot chart, it will be dynamically linked to your pivot table. So when you update your pivot table, the pivot chart will also update. So to create a pivot chart, you can select your pivot table and go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and select Pivot Chart. And that's going to open up this Insert Chart menu, and you can select from various different chart types here. And when you select a chart type, there's different options for that chart type along the top here. So let's go with a column chart, and let's go with the basic column chart and press OK. And that creates our pivot chart. And now when we update our pivot table, our pivot chart is also going to update. So let's say we add in gender into this pivot table. Then you can see that our pivot chart updates with that new field as well. So that's how you can create charts that are dynamically linked to your pivot tables. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can add a slicer to our pivot table. So a slicer is just a visual filter that's always displayed in your workbook. So to add a slicer, you can select your pivot table and go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and choose the Insert Slicer command. And that's going to give you the option to insert a slicer for one or more of the fields in your data. So let's add in a slicer for gender. And notice that my pivot table doesn't have the gender field in it. So you can add slicers to filter data based on fields that aren't in your pivot table. So let's press OK. And here's our new slicer object, and it's got the items in our gender field. And then you can click on either of those and filter your pivot table to just that data. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how to insert a timeline for your pivot tables. So a timeline is just like a slicer. It's a visual filter, but it's for date fields. So we can select our pivot table and go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and insert a timeline. And this time we're only going to be able to select date fields in our data. So we can select our start date and press OK. And then we get this filter here. It's a timeline filter. And it's going to allow us to filter on different dates. So here I'm filtering on August, September, October, and November. And if we want to, we can change this to be able to filter on different years. Here I'm filtered on 2014, 2015, and 2016, etc. So we also have months and days available. So that's how we can add a timeline filter to our pivot tables. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can connect multiple pivot tables to the same slicer. So I've got two pivot tables here and a slicer, and you can see that this slicer only affects the first pivot table. So I can connect the other pivot table to this slicer by right-clicking on the slicer and going to Report Connections. And that's going to give me the option to add other pivot tables. So I can check off that other pivot table and press OK. And now this slicer is going to work with both those pivot tables. So that's how you can add multiple pivot tables to a slicer. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can filter our pivot table to the top N or bottom N results. So we can add a top N filter by clicking on the Sort and Filter toggle and in the Value Filters section. we have an option for top 10, and that's going to open up the top 10 filter menu for our job role fields. And here we can choose a couple options, so we can choose to show the top or bottom results. And we can change that 10 to something else, so we can show the top 3 items. And if we had more than one field in our values area, we could choose which fields to show the results by. And we can press OK. And now we're filtered on the top 3 results here. So that's how we can filter on the top or bottom results in our pivot table. In this tip, we're going to take a look at how we can add multiple subtotals to a pivot table. So in this pivot table, I've got 2 fields in the rows area. I've got gender and education level in there. And because I've got multiple fields in my rows area, you can see that I get some subtotals here. So at the gender level, I have subtotals. And these subtotals are just the sum of the values below. So we can add different types of subtotals into our pivot table. If I go to the gender field and click on that and open the field settings, then you can see that subtotals is set to automatic. So that just means the subtotal type is going to be the same as what we've got in our values area here. So we're taking a subtotal that's the sum. But we can choose to add custom subtotals. So we can take a sum or a count or an average. And you can in fact select multiple of these. So let's select sum, count, average, and max and min. And press OK. And you can see that we get those subtotals here. So even though our pivot table is displaying the sum of the monthly salaries, we can get different information such as the average monthly salary for females, or the max or min value, etc. So that's how you can add multiple subtotals to your pivot tables. In this tip, we're going to take a look at the show values as options. So with the show values as options, this is going to allow you to display the results of your pivot table as different types of calculations. So for example, we could display the values here as a percentage of the grand total. So to do that, we can right click on the value and select show values as. And here we have a lot of options for the show values as calculations. In this example, we're going to choose percent of grand total. And now our values are displayed as a percentage of the grand total. So here we can see that the bachelor level of education makes up 39% of the total monthly salaries. So that's how you can use the show values as calculations in your pivot tables. Want more awesome Excel tips? Then sign up for my Excel newsletter. So the link for that is in the description below this video. When you sign up for the newsletter, I'll send you a free copy of my Excel tips ebook. And I'll also send you a free copy of my mega book of Excel keyboard shortcuts and my ultimate guide to VLOOKUP. If you enjoyed this video, you can help me out by hitting the thumbs up button and subscribing to this channel if you haven't already done so. That's it for this video. See you in the next one.